You know what's scary about Jupiter's moon, Io? It's already the most volcanic place we know. It doesn't need help. It doesn't need a trigger. It's a furnace that never stops breathing. So when Io suddenly spiked in activity like a wave rolling across its surface, the first question wasn't, can Io erupt? The question was why now, and why did it look coordinated? Because this didn't feel like random chaos. It felt like timing. Like something pressed a button, and the moon answered in stages, one hotspot after another, almost like a signal traveling. And right before that wave began, one object was sliding through the system like a quiet shadow that nobody wanted to take too seriously. 3i Atlas, the interstellar visitor? People love talking about comets like they're dumb snowballs. Pretty tails, simple orbits, nothing personal, but 3i Atlas has never felt like nothing personal. It shows up from outside, crosses paths with the giants, and suddenly, the most unstable moon in the solar system starts acting like it got an instruction, not just a heat pulse. NASA didn't announce anything dramatic. Observatories didn't scream alien signal. The official language stayed calm, as always, because calm language buys time. But the data doesn't care about calm language. The data shows patterns. And Io's patterns started changing in a way that's hard to handwave as coincidence. Here's what we saw first. Infrared hotspots brightened faster than expected, and not in one place. It wasn't one volcano going wild, it was multiple regions waking up. Then came the second layer, the part that makes your skin crawl a little. The brightening wasn't simultaneous. It moved like a chain reaction with gaps. A few hours here, then another cluster, another delay, another flare. Like the surface was receiving pulses, and each pulse kicked the next region into motion. Now, Io does have a reason to be extreme. Jupiter's gravity needs it like a stress ball, squeezing and stretching the moon until its interior melts. That tidal heating is real, and it's brutal. Io is basically a world-sized engine powered by orbital stress, and it vents that energy through volcanoes non-stop. So yes, Io erupts all the time, but this event didn't look like the normal random mess of eruptions. It looked like a synchronized surge, and synchronized surges need a driver. Something changed in the system just enough to push Io over a threshold it was already close to crossing. That's where 3i Atlas enters the frame again, because its timing lines up with the window when Jupiter's environment is most sensitive. Jupiter isn't just a planet. It's a machine with a magnetosphere so huge it makes Earth look like a toy, filled with charged particles and invisible pressure. Io sits inside that machine. It feeds it. It gets fed by it. Plasma flows around it, hits it, drags along magnetic lines like cables under tension. If anything nudges that system, even slightly, Io reacts fast. Because it's already stressed, it's already hot, it's already unstable. It's one push away from a surge. And 3i Atlas is exactly the kind of object that could deliver a push without looking dramatic because it doesn't need to crash into anything. All it needs is to change the geometry of fields and flow for a short window. Like a hand sliding through water and creating a pressure wave behind it. You don't see that pressure wave with your eyes. You see it in how particles move, how radiation belts shift, how moons start acting off script. So the first thing scientists checked wasn't the lava, it was Jupiter's environment, the particle counts, the magnetometer readings, the energy distribution, and they noticed anomalies that didn't fit the usual rhythm, not a giant storm. Not a classic solar flare impact, something quieter, tighter, more local. Think of it like this. A hurricane is obvious, but a small pressure front can still change your weather if it arrives at the worst possible moment. Io's interior is always at the worst possible moment, it's always primed. The magma is always close. The crust is always cracked and waiting. So when the wave started, it wasn't Io became volcanic. It was Io became more volcanic than its own baseline. And that baseline is already insane. Then the story got even stranger, because the wave wasn't just heat, it was accompanied by changes in the gas and dust around Io's orbit. Io constantly feeds a torus of sulfur and oxygen ions around Jupiter, like a glowing ring of material. That ring changes when Io changes. During the surge, that torus showed a shift in density that looked too structured, like a ripple moving through it, not just a messy increase. And now the uncomfortable question lands. If Io's volcanic surge sent a ripple through Jupiter's plasma environment, what caused the first ripple? Because in a coupled system, the first push matters most. Once you push, everything else becomes a chain reaction you can blame on natural dynamics. So we look at the timeline again, and we notice something sharp. The early phase lines up with 3i Atlas passing through a key geometry corridor, not close to Io physically, close to the system's sensitive alignment, where Jupiter, the solar wind, and the magnetosphere shape become easier to disturb. This is why you can't dismiss it as just another comet. A normal comet doesn't arrive with this kind of coincidence stacking behind it, and it gets worse when you remember something simple. Jupiter's moons are locked in a resonance, a gravitational rhythm that keeps them tugging each other. Io, Europa, and Ganymede are tied together like gears. If one gear changes load, the others feel it. If Io surges, the whole pattern shifts slightly. That means a wave in Io isn't just Io's problem. It's a system event, a stress event, a moment where energy and timing leak into the wider machine. So now we have two possibilities, and both are bad in different ways. Either this surge was natural and we got unlucky with timing, or something external pushed Jupiter's environment into a mode that made Io erupt in a coordinated way, like a drumbeat triggering a chorus. I'm not saying 3i Atlas commanded volcanoes like a sci-fi villain. I'm saying the physics allows a small trigger to create a big response. That's what unstable systems do. They hide energy quietly, then release it all at once when the last tiny condition flips from not yet to now. And if 3i Atlas can flip that condition at Jupiter, it means it can interact with the most violent magnetic engine in our neighborhood, which raises a bigger, uglier thought. If it can poke Jupiter's environment, it can practice on the biggest playground before coming closer to us. Because Jupiter is the perfect testbed, huge magnetosphere, multiple moons, tons of measurable signals, a place where you can cause effects that look natural, and that's why this story matters. Not because Io had a bad day, but because the pattern looks like a wave and waves don't happen without a source. So the question isn't did Io erupt? The question is what changed in Jupiter's system to make Io erupt like that, in sequence, with structure? And once you ask that, you're forced to look at 3i Atlas again, not as a passing rock, but as a moving variable inside a sensitive machine. Here's the clean chain you need to see, because once you see it, Io's wave stops looking random and starts looking like a system reacting to a trigger it can't ignore. Jupiter isn't just big, it's active, like a generator the size of a planet, spinning fast and throwing invisible force lines outward like stretched rubber bands. Io sits inside that force like a match inside a storm, and the connection between them isn't poetic, it's real, like a live cable carrying energy back and forth. There's a stream of charged particles locked between Jupiter and Io, and when it intensifies, it dumps energy into Io's surface like a heater turning up. Normally that cable hums in a messy way, rising and falling with Jupiter's rotation, solar wind pressure, and the constant chaos of plasma slamming around the system. But this time, the hum didn't wobble, it stepped, like someone tightened the string on a guitar until it hit a sharper note and held it long enough to matter. That's why the surge looked coordinated, because the trigger wasn't a volcano decided to erupt, it was the environment forcing multiple weak points to crack. If you picture Io's crust like thin ice over boiling water, the only question is what makes the ice fail in a wave instead of in random little pops? The answer is timing, because pressure applied evenly doesn't create a wave, but pressure applied in pulses does, especially when the surface already has cracks waiting. Now bring 3i Atlas back into the scene, because this object doesn't need to touch Io to matter, it only needs to disturb the flow Jupiter is swimming in. Jupiter's magnetosphere acts like a giant windsock, and solar wind pressure can squeeze it, stretch it, and snap it back, like a lung-breathing plasma. So if something changes the pressure pattern even slightly, the whole structure flexes, and that flex changes the current running through the Jupiter-Io cable. That current spike is the hidden punch, because it can superheat specific regions, change stress instantly, and turn almost erupting zones into erupting now. When the cable surges, it doesn't heat Io like a stove, it heats it like friction, and friction loves weak points, the thinnest crust, the most loaded faults. That's why the first hotspots brightened fast, because the weakest vents responded first, and once they vented, the pressure moved sideways through the crust. And once pressure moves sideways, you don't get one eruption, you get a chain, because every eruption changes the local load and shoves the next region closer. This is the part most people miss. Io's volcanoes aren't isolated fireworks, they're valves on a pressurized network, and opening one valve changes the whole system. So the wave wasn't magic, it was domino physics, triggered by a current spike that made multiple valves open in the same phase window. Now watch what happens above Io, because the gas it throws out doesn't just vanish, it becomes plasma, and that plasma feeds the bright ring around Jupiter. That ring is like a highway of charged sulfur and oxygen, and when Io dumps more material into it, the highway gets thicker and starts behaving differently. During the surge, that ring didn't just grow, it rippled, like a shock traveling through a fluid, which is exactly what you get when injection happens in pulses. And those pulses lined up with Jupiter's rotation in a weirdly clean way, like the system was locked into a rhythm, not stumbling through chaos. If you've ever seen a fan blade hit the same spot again and again, you know how small timing changes become huge when they repeat over and over. Io's orbit is the same kind of repeating setup, and if something nudges the phase, even slightly, the same region gets hit harder each cycle. So imagine three aughts, and the Atlas adds a tiny bias to the environment, and Jupiter's field keeps applying that bias every spin, like a hammer tapping the same crack. That's how you get a wave that doesn't explode once and die, but spreads, because each spin of Jupiter becomes another beat in the sequence. Now here's the nastiest detail. Once Io erupts harder, it also changes the cable itself, because the plasma density around it shifts the conductivity. In simple words, the stronger the eruption, the stronger the electrical connection can become, which turns one trigger into a feedback loop. That feedback loop is why the activity felt like it learned the rhythm, because after the first spike, the system was more ready for the next one, and that's when people noticed a second signature. The auroral footprints on Jupiter tied to Io look sharper, as if the cable was carrying a cleaner punch. Those footprints are like burn marks where the current slams into Jupiter's atmosphere, and when they brighten in a pattern, it means the current is patterned. So now your story has a spine: external push, magnetosphere flex, current spike, crust valves open, plasma ring ripples, feedback strengthens the next beat. And if that spine is real, then Io is not the final effect. It's the loudest one, because Europa and Ganymede are sitting in the same machine. They don't erupt lava like Io, but they can react in their own ways. Cracks, plumes, subtle warming. The kind of changes that look small until they add up. That's why this matters more than a pretty volcano show, because it suggests 3i Atlas can push Jupiter's whole environment into a new mode. And when a system as big as Jupiter shifts mode, it doesn't stop at one moon. It spreads pressure across every connected part like tension moving through a net. So the real question isn't, did Io erupt? The real question is what else in Jupiter's system got nudged quietly while everyone stared at the lava. Now let me show you where this turns from Io went wild into Jupiter's whole engine shifted. Because the plasma ring around the planet started behaving like a tuned instrument. The Io plasma torus is normally bright and messy, always changing, always twitching, but this time it formed a ripple that moved like a front, as if someone injected material in pulses. That ripple wasn't just more sulfur floating around, it was a reorganized flow, and when flow reorganizes inside a magnetic field, the field responds like a tightened net snapping into shape. Within hours, instruments watching Jupiter's radio emissions picked up a change in tone. Not a new signal with words, but a cleaner, more repetitive pattern in the natural noise. Jupiter's radio voice is usually chaotic, like static from a storm, yet this sounded like the static found a beat, and once static finds a beat, you know something forced coherence. And then the auroras reacted, because auroras are the visual fingerprint of charged particles slamming into atmosphere, and that fingerprint suddenly sharpened in places tied to Io. The bright spots where Io's current hits Jupiter didn't just brighten, they brightened on schedule, like they were being pumped, and that schedule matched the timing of the torus ripple. This is where you stop thinking eruption and start thinking feedback, because the cable between Io and Jupiter looked like it was carrying cleaner bursts, not random surges. Once the cable cleans up, the whole loop strengthens, because a stronger loop heats Io more, and a hotter Io dumps more material, and that extra material makes the loop stronger again. It's a simple vicious circle, and the only reason it doesn't run away every day is because Jupiter's system usually can't hold a stable rhythm, long enough to lock it in. But during this event, the rhythm held, and that's why the wave on Io kept stepping forward instead of fading, like the system stayed in drive mode instead of drifting back to neutral. Now here's the twist that pulled Europa into the story, because Europa sits deeper in Jupiter's magnetic environment and it reacts not with lava, but with cracks and pressure release. Europa doesn't need to erupt fire to be dangerous, it just needs to vent. because a plume from an ocean world means the crust opened, and opening means stress moved through the shell. During the Io surge window, a few Europa observations showed faint anomalies, a subtle brightening near the limb, the kind that looks meaningless until it repeats in the same geometry. Nothing loud, nothing cinematic, but a soft signature that suggests material above the surface, and if that's true, it means Europa's crust felt the system shift and answered quietly. Think of the moons as drums in the same room, and Jupiter as the bass. When the bass hits a new rhythm, the other drums start vibrating even if nobody touches them directly. That's why scientists started comparing timestamps across moons, because if Europa shows even a small response in the same window, then the trigger wasn't local, it was system-wide, and the deeper they looked, the more they noticed tiny changes in Jupiter's current sheet, the thin plasma layer that wobbles like a skirt around the planet's equator. A small change in that sheet can change where particle pressure lands, and particle pressure is the invisible hand that can heat surfaces, charge dust, and mess with weak boundaries. Now bring 3i Atlas back into your mind, because the uncomfortable part is that the coherence began when its trajectory lined up with the direction of incoming solar wind pressure. It's like the object didn't push Jupiter by force, but by positioning, by making the environment's geometry more grippable, so Jupiter's field could lock into a tighter response. That sounds abstract, so here's the simple version. The system found a handle, and once it found a handle, it started turning, and the turning showed up as rhythm in everything. That rhythm also showed in the timing of Io's brightest outbursts, because the hottest vents peaked near the same rotational phase, like they were being nudged at the same moment. Normal volcanism doesn't care about Jupiter's clock like that, but a current-driven push does, and that's the clue that tells you the driver was outside the crust, not inside it. At this point, the most careful teams asked a brutal question. Did we just watch a natural resonance, or did we watch a resonance that got kickstarted on purpose? Officially, nobody will say on purpose, because intent is not a scientific parameter, but you and I both know. Pattern recognition is how humans survive unknown environments, and the pattern here is that the system didn't just flare, it organized, it formed a sequence, it held coherence, and then it released it, as if it completed a short program. That program left one more mark, a temporary shift in Jupiter's auroral oval shape, a slight tightening that suggests the magnetosphere was briefly compressed in a controlled way. Compression alone could come from solar wind, sure, but the timing lined up with the internal ripple, like the compression and the ripple were coupled instead of independent. And if they were coupled, then something changed the coupling, meaning the system's boundary conditions were altered, meaning the environment was momentarily redesigned. This is why Io's wave matters to Earth's story, because if 3i Atlas can influence coupling at Jupiter, it can practice on a giant, and practice is how precision is built. So the question becomes, what was the output of this practice? Was it just heat and lava, or did it also teach 3i Atlas how Jupiter's field responds to certain positions? Because once you know a field's response, you can predict it, and once you can predict it, you can time your next move to ride the response like a surfer rides a wave. Here's where the whole thing stops being a Jupiter event and starts feeling like something that can reach farther, because Jupiter doesn't sit in a bubble, it leaks. Anything that reorganizes Jupiter's magnetic engine doesn't just stay near the planet, it pushes ripples into the space around it like a speaker pushing air. You can't see those ripples with your eyes, but you can catch them in the way particles arrive, in the way fields tilt, and in the way space sounds on instruments. After Io's wave locked into rhythm, a similar rhythm appeared in Jupiter's outer environment, like a pulse train, moving away from the planet. Not random, but timed. That's the key word, timed. Because if it's timed, you can follow it, and if you can follow it, you can predict where it should show up next. Think of the solar wind like a river, always moving outward from the sun, and Jupiter like a huge boulder in that river creating a wake you can track. Normally the wake is messy, but during this event it looked cleaner, as if the river didn't just splash, it carried a repeating pattern downstream. And downstream in space doesn't mean toward Earth directly, but it means the pattern becomes part of the flow the entire system swims inside. This is where people get comfortable and say, okay, even if that's true, it's still far away, it won't matter here. And that comfort is exactly the trap. Because distance doesn't protect you from a pattern, it only delays it, and delays are dangerous when they convince you nothing is coming. The rhythm that formed near Jupiter had a spacing that matched the auroral pulses, and that matched the torus ripple, and that matched Io's stepping surge. That should not happen by accident across different layers of the system, because different layers have different chaos, and chaos doesn't agree this politely. So the working idea became simple and ugly. Jupiter's whole environment was briefly turned into a transmitter, not speaking words, but stamping rhythm into flow. Once flow carries rhythm, it can carry it for a long time, especially if nothing hits it hard enough to break it, and space is emptier than you think. This is the part that feels like a quiet horror, because you don't need a beam aimed at Earth to create effects on Earth, you just need to alter the medium. We live inside the medium, we rely on it, our satellites, our signals, our navigation, all of it assumes space is mostly stable most of the time. So when a repeating deformation rides the solar wind, it becomes like a rolling unevenness in the road, and everything moving on that road starts to bounce. The first sign wasn't a blackout, it was a set of small timing quirks. Tiny shifts in signal delay that look like normal noise until you compare them. And when you compare them, you see the same spacing again, like a heartbeat you didn't know you were listening to. Now imagine what that means if the pulse isn't natural weather, but a pattern that was made clean on purpose in Jupiter's giant magnetic machine. It means 3i Atlas didn't need to push Earth directly. It only needed to learn how to make a big planet write a rhythm into the background flow. Jupiter is the perfect teacher for that, because it's loud, measurable, and powerful, and anything you learn there scales to weaker systems later. So the scary thought is not Jupiter was disturbed, it's Jupiter was used, like a tuning fork hit once to see what frequency the room prefers. And once you know the room's frequency, you can make smaller pushes feel larger, because resonance does most of the work for you. That's exactly what Io looked like, a world already under stress that responded too cleanly to a rhythm it didn't choose. So what happens when the same method meets Earth, a planet with its own magnetic shield, its own resonances, and its own fragile dependence on timing? Earth's field is weaker than Jupiter's, but our infrastructure is far more sensitive, and sensitivity means you can do more with less. You don't need to melt a crust to cause damage. You only need to bend synchronization long enough for systems to drift and for people to doubt their instruments. The moment you make people doubt instruments, you gain a strange kind of control, because confusion spreads faster than any physical wave ever could. And this is why the ripple in the wind idea matters, because it explains how something far away can start changing confidence here without ever touching us. It also explains the weird cleanliness of the sequence, because solar wind is chaotic, yet the pulse survived long enough to be recognized. That survival suggests the pulse was injected strongly into the structure of the field, like carving a groove into moving water instead of throwing in a pebble. A pebble splash disappears, but a groove changes how the river flows, and this event looked less like a splash and more like a short-lived groove. Now here's the detail nobody liked admitting. The pulse seemed to strengthen when Jupiter's wake aligned with a certain direction in the wider flow. That means geometry mattered, not just force, like the system had an angle where the environment locks and carries patterns better. And if geometry matters, then an object like 3i Atlas can choose moments, because a traveler can wait for a corridor where small actions travel far. That brings us back to the original fear. 3i Atlas doesn't behave like a drifting snowball. It behaves like a thing that benefits from timing. And once timing is a feature, you stop asking what happened, and you start asking what's the next window. Because if part 1 was Io, part 2 was Jupiter's engine, and part 3 was coherence, then part 4 is propagation, the pattern leaving home and moving outward. And nothing that propagates stays polite forever, because sooner or later it hits something that reacts, and Earth is the most reactive place in the inner system. So when the pulse finally brushed Earth, it didn't arrive like a solar storm with sirens and headlines. It arrived like a tiny misalignment that shouldn't exist. The first clue wasn't in telescopes. It was in timing systems that keep the world stitched together, where microseconds matter more than people realize. A few networks showed brief drift between nodes that are normally locked tight, then everything snapped back, cleanly, like the disturbance passed through and moved on. Engineers called it transient jitter and tried to forget it, because jitter is common, and nobody wants to be the person who panics over a blip. But this blip had a fingerprint. The spacing between fluctuations matched the rhythm that showed up near Jupiter, the same pulse interval hiding inside the noise. That's when the story stops feeling far away, because once you recognize a rhythm, you stop seeing random weather, and you start seeing something knocking. Space weather monitors checked the sun first, because that's the normal culprit, but the sun didn't deliver a spike big enough to explain the clean structure. No major flare lined up, no classic shock front, nothing that screams, "Here's your cause." The environment looked calm, yet the timing went weird anyway. Then GPS corrections showed a small anomaly. Not your phone breaks, but precision layers that usually stay invisible started looking slightly less stable. Aviation didn't fall out of the sky. Ships didn't get lost. But the systems that love perfect stability felt a soft push, like the floor moved a millimeter. And if you've ever worked with tight tolerances, you know a millimeter isn't small when it appears with no obvious cause and with a rhythm you've already seen before. At almost the same time, Earth's magnetosphere showed a subtle flex, not a big compression, but a gentle shape change. Like pressure hit it, held, then released. That flex created tiny variations in particle density around certain orbital paths, and satellites moving through those regions reported odd charge behavior. Again, nothing dramatic. Just the kind of little spacecraft discomfort that gets logged, archived, and forgotten because most of it is normal in space. But here's what wasn't normal. The charge effects clustered in time, and the cluster repeated once, then again, like the pulse brushed us in more than one pass. It felt like a wave front, with structure, not a random gust. And structure means the disturbance had shape before it reached Earth. Some ground stations monitoring HF radio saw short-lived fading in specific bands, like the ionosphere became slightly less transparent for a moment. Chang F, fading happens? Sure, but the timing lined up too neatly with the magnetosphere flex, like two layers of Earth's environment reacted together. That's the scary part, because once layers react together, you're not looking at a local glitch anymore, you're looking at coupling. Coupling means a small external disturbance can create a larger internal response if it pushes the right mode at the right moment. Earth has modes, resonant behaviors, quiet rhythms in the field and plasma that nobody notices until something taps the system in sync. So the question becomes simple. Did a natural wave from the solar wind tap Earth in sync, or did something make the wave clean enough to tap on purpose? And once that question exists, 3 the Atlas stops being background decoration and becomes the only moving piece that keeps aligning with every impossible timing window. Because the pulse pattern wasn't just in Earth systems. It appeared as a faint periodicity in the upstream particle flow, like a ladder of small steps. It didn't look like a storm wall. It looked like a designed ripple, gentle enough to slip through defenses, strong enough to leave a measurable mark. The part that chilled people wasn't the effect itself. It was the fact that the effect ended cleanly, as if the disturbance had a start and a stop switch. Nature doesn't always end cleanly, nature smears. It fades messy. This did not smear the way you'd expect from random turbulence. Then came the second uncomfortable observation. The disturbance didn't hit every region equally. It favored certain magnetic longitudes. That means geometry mattered again. Like the wave interacted with Earth's field more efficiently along a specific alignment. If you can predict alignments, you can predict outcomes, and if you can predict outcomes, you can do tests without making a mess. And that's exactly what this felt like. A test pass, a probe, a light touch to see how Earth responds to a rhythm injected far away. Just like Io, just like Jupiter's engine. Same story, different scale, and the same strategy. Push the system where it's already sensitive. Earth is sensitive in a way Jupiter isn't. Not because we're weaker, but because we built a world that depends on phase stability. We turned time into infrastructure. We turned synchronization into safety. We turned normal noise into the invisible glue of civilization. So a pulse that can introduce structured jitter becomes more than a curiosity. It becomes a lever that could be pulled harder later. And remember, the pulse that reached us wasn't the original event. It was the downstream echo of something that happened near Jupiter, which means the source was strong enough to survive distance and clean enough to keep its spacing, which is rare for pure randomness. At this point, the big fear isn't we're under attack. The big fear is we're being mapped, because mapping requires repetition and control. You touch lightly, observe, adjust, repeat, and you learn where the system is stiff, where it is soft, and where it amplifies a tiny push. That's how you learn how to move a planet without touching it, using its own environment as the handle. And 3i Atlas keeps appearing at the edge of every handle, like it knows which corridor makes the system easiest to grip. The worst part is how easy it is to ignore this, because nobody wants to build a terrifying story out of microseconds and subtle field flex. But microseconds are where the world breaks first, because they are where certainty lives, and once certainty slips, everything downstream gets shaky. So the second pass didn't feel like a repeat, it felt like escalation, like the pulse learned our response and came back cleaner, sharper, and slightly heavier. This time the timing drift wasn't just a single blip, it arrived in a short burst train, 3 clusters separated by the same interval we saw in Jupiter's wake. Engineers blamed routing, load, even firmware. But the burst pattern showed up across systems that don't share hardware, which is how you know it's environmental. And the environment answered with light, because auroras over the polar regions began to shift, not in brightness alone, but in shape, like the oval was being tugged. Auroras are basically Earth's magnetosphere drawing a map of incoming energy, and during this window the map looked too organized to be random weather. A thin arc formed, then split, then rejoined, like a waveform drawn on the sky, and the timing of those changes matched the same pulse spacing again. If you've watched Io's wave, you already recognize the motion: step, pause, as if a beat is traveling through a medium that resists, then yields. Earth shouldn't mirror Io this closely, but the similarity wasn't poetic, it was geometric. The same kind of staged response in a stressed magnetic system. Satellites in polar orbits reported unusual charging spikes. At the same moments, the auroral arcs sharpened, like particles were being guided, not scattered. That guidance is what makes people nervous, because guidance implies structure, and structure implies that the disturbance arrived already shaped. Solar wind monitors upstream saw a faint staircase pattern in density and velocity, tiny steps that lined up perfectly with the burst hitting our systems. It's like someone was tapping the magnetosphere with a metronome, gentle taps, but timed well enough that the system started ringing on its own. When Earth rings, it does it through field line resonances, natural oscillations that can amplify a small push into a larger motion. That's why the auroras looked clean, because resonance cleans noise, it takes messy input and turns it into a narrow band response you can actually see. Now here's the part that made the room go quiet. The pulse didn't arrive from the usual direction of solar wind features. It arrived with a slight angular offset, as if the disturbance was riding inside the wind, but not created by the sun's normal turbulence. That offset pointed back toward the region of space where 3Li Atlas had been tracked, not as a straight line shot, but as a corridor alignment. And right as the strongest burst hit, 3Li Atlas did something that should not show up in our data at all. It produced a brief spike in optical brightness. Not a comet flare like a dust outburst, but a clean, fast brighten and drop, like a reflection or emission that switched on and off. You can argue albedo, rotation, viewing angle, sure, but the timing was too perfect. Sync to the auroral step, sync to the network jitter. That's the moment you stop treating it as a passive visitor, because passive things don't sync to 3 independent layers of a system. And then the magnetosphere did something worse. It tightened, like a belt pulled one notch, compressing plasma regions and changing drift paths in minutes. That tightening forced a small rearrangement of radiation belts. Not a disaster, but a measurable relocation of where particles concentrate. Those relocations touched satellites in just the wrong way, creating minor anomalies that looked unrelated until you overlay the pulse schedule. Overlay it, and the anomalies line up like beads, exactly at the peaks of the burst train, exactly when the auroras snapped into sharper geometry. It looked like Earth was being driven through a short program, Phase 1 tap, Phase 2 lock, Phase 3 release, with pauses that felt intentional. After the third peak, everything relaxed again, but not back to the old baseline. The baseline shifted slightly, like the system learned a new equilibrium. That's the same signature we saw on Io. The first surge changes the loop, the second strengthens it, and the third leaves a memory in the system. A memory means the next pulse doesn't need to be stronger, it only needs to be timed, because the system is already primed to respond. And now you're staring at the nightmare logic. 3i Atlas might be building resonance ladders, step by step, across different worlds. Jupiter first, because it's loud and forgiving, Io as the stress gauge, then Earth, because Earth is sensitive and measurable down to microseconds. If that's the method, then the boldest move isn't a crash or a beam. It's forcing 2 separate planetary systems to ring on the same beat. Because once systems ring together, you can transfer patterns through the medium, and the medium is the solar wind we all share. So the question isn't whether the auroras were pretty, the question is what happens when the pulse returns again, but longer and closer to our core rhythms. This time, it didn't knock and leave, it stayed. The pulse came back, and instead of 3 neat bursts, it stretched into a long pressure hold, like a hand resting on the shield. At first you'd miss it because nothing broke. But the auroral arc stopped behaving like quick flashes and started behaving like a slow breathing pattern, steady and stubborn. The weird part was the steadiness. Space weather usually jitters. It spikes, it fades, it stutters. This didn't stutter. It held the same beat long enough to matter, and when a beat holds, Earth begins to lock to it, the way a swing locks to a push, even if the push is gentle, because resonance does the heavy lifting. You could see it in the ionosphere first, where radio paths bent slightly wrong for minutes at a time, like the upper air turned into a soft lens that kept changing shape. Air traffic didn't crash, but controllers saw small glitches in signal clarity, and ships logged brief navigation corrections that looked like normal drift until you overlay the timing. Overlay the timing and it becomes ugly. The distortions rose and fell in a smooth cycle, matching the auroras, matching the particle steps, matching that same pulse, DNA. Now watch the magnetosphere itself. It began to wobble as a whole. Not violently, but like a bell being rubbed at the rim until it starts to sing. That wobble moved energy into regions that don't usually get fed so evenly, and satellites crossing those paths saw repeated charging events like clockwork. The world down here felt nothing, but the machines felt it, because machines don't have intuition, they only have thresholds, and this pulse kept walking them toward those thresholds. The scariest clue was how clean the start was. The cycle didn't ramp from noise, it turned on, it settled into a stable rhythm, and it stayed there like it was tuned. And right when it locked, 3i Atlas brightened again for a heartbeat. The same sharp on-off signature, not a messy flare, but a controlled blink. You can call it rotation, you can call it dust, but the blink sat exactly on the lock point, as if the object was confirming the system grabbed the frequency. Then came the first real human effect. Not on screens, but in power grid monitoring, where tiny reactive loads begin to drift in ways operators hate. No blackout, but increased corrections, more fine balancing, more small alarms that clear themselves. The kind that makes you tired because you can't catch a cause. That's what a sustained loop does. It doesn't smash you. It forces you to spend effort holding steady, and over time the effort becomes a weakness. Up north, the auroras began forming a double band, a thin second arc that tracked the first, like a shadow line, suggesting the field was oscillating in 2 layers. 2 layers means the system is splitting its response like a rope, vibrating with 2 modes at once, and once that happens, the behavior becomes harder to predict. The pulse kept feeding those modes gently, and the result was a quiet amplification, not a jump, but a slow climb in coherence that felt like a trap closing. And then the timing drift returned, longer this time, not a blip, but a smear across multiple minutes, as if the clock of the environment itself was stretching. If you've never cared about microseconds, this is where you start caring, because modern finance, navigation, and secure links are built on clocks agreeing. You don't need to shut anything down to cause damage. You only need to make trust wobble, make measurements disagree, make operators chase ghosts. Now here's the darker layer. The pulse didn't hit everywhere equally. It focused on certain longitudes again, like it had a preferred corridor through Earth's field. Preferred corridor means geometry, and geometry means planning, because random wind doesn't choose neat corridors, it splashes across whatever it meets. And this corridor lined up with the same offset direction, the same not quite solar angle, like the disturbance was riding the wind, but steering inside it. The sustained loop lasted just long enough for Earth to start adapting, then it released cleanly, and the release was almost worse than the hold. Because when the hold dropped, the system overshot like a spring snapping back, and that overshoot produced a short spike of particle rain into polar regions. Satellites reported a brief storm of tiny hits. Nothing fatal, but noisy enough to corrupt a few packets and force resets, little stings that prove the field can be shaken. And then, as if to leave a signature, the auroral oval shifted by a small angle and stayed. Shifted, like the whole map of incoming energy rotated slightly. That shift is the closest thing to a fingerprint you can get, because it says the system didn't just get pushed, it got recentered around a new balance. So the question you should be asking right now is simple. If a traveler can lock Earth's field into a loop, even briefly, what happens on the next attempt?